Hello, my name is Cameron Thomas. I'll be discussing the important main topics from chapter 1 to 10 from the Learning and Behavior written by Paul James. Right, chapter 1, Learning to Change. Over 2,000 years ago, Lucretius stated that change is the only constant, meaning that change is inevitable and is going to occur. It's not the exception to the rule, but it is the rule. And it can happen daily, take years, decades, or millennia. So that brings me to natural selection. Charles Darwin wanted to figure out how these species were fighting for limited resources, so he came to the conclusion and idea of natural selection, which is nature's way of breeding and the survival of the fittest. That brings us to evolution, which is slowly occurring over many generations. It helps the species, but not the organism, meaning that natural selection was nature's way, and it still is nature's way, of picking the most favorable characteristics and passing them down through generation, and that is how species have evolved and adapted. But we also have mutations, which are abrupt genetic changes that could potentially help the individual. Learning is a change in behavior due to experience. It's evolved modifiability. Behavior is the result of learning, but is not the result of learning, but it is learning. Stimuli from the environment can trigger this change in behavior. So that brings us to the nature versus nurture. It's the longest rung in debate, and it implies that one or the other is correct. However, scientists and researchers have found that they work together. It's not just one or a certain percentage of one. They're completely intertwined. Chapter 2, the study of learning and behavior. Many scientists take the natural science approach to studying behavior, um, meaning that learning is a natural phenomenon, and they take on these four assumptions. The first is that all natural phenomena is caused. Stuff doesn't just happen. Second is that causes precede their effects. The third is that causes of natural events only include natural phenomena. Stuff cannot be attributed to things like God. It has to have a physical reason. And the fourth is that the simplest explanation fits the data the best, the law of parsimony. Fewer the assumptions for an explanation, the better. Basic measures of learning include errors, topography, intensity, speed, latency, rate, and fluency. Sources of data include anecdotes, which are personal experiences, case studies, which are studies of particular individual in detail, descriptive statistics, which is analyzing data from a group, and experimental studies, which is manipulation of the variable to observe desired effects. And those can include between subject, which groups experience different IVs or independent variables, or within subjects where groups experience the same independent variables. Researchers generally think that animal research is essential for understanding human behavior, but some objections to include that we are not animals, meaning that people don't believe that we should do research on animals because they're not human beings and we're different organisms. However, animal research helps in controlling issues of hereditary, learning history, and other ethical considerations. Additionally, it would still be needed even if we were to use like computer simulations, because we still have to learn the behavior before we can plug it into an AI program and teach it to act like the animals. Chapter 3, Pavlovian Conditioning. Pavlov started his work by observing the circulatory system and moved into the physiology of digestion. From there, he began studying the salivatory reflexes of dogs, and he noticed that heavy salivation occurred when dry food was present, but not when watery food was present. over time, he shifted his focus to psychic reflexes. He discovered unconditional reflexes, which occurring regularly for all unconditionally, and conditional reflexes, which varies from individual to individual depending on experiences. So unconditional meaning that they're unlearned in their species reflexes, and conditional meaning that they're learned or acquired their individual reflexes. He then went on to discover other things like the unconditional stimulus and the unconditional response. So the US and the UR. For example, the US would be meat powder and the UR would be salivation. He also discovered the conditional stimulus and the conditional response. So the CS and the CR. CS, for example, would be a food bowl and the CR would be salivation. Classical conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning occurs when you pair the CS to the US to get the CR. So the CS is added to the US and you get the UR, and then over time the US goes away, so the CS just elicits the CR. High order conditioning means that pairing a neutral stimulus with a well established CS without using the US, or otherwise known as second order conditioning. You can use test trials to measure learning by the present CS alone. A response means CR is present, or no response means no learning occurred. One problem is pseudo-conditioning. It's when a neutral stimulus elicited a conditioned response after the unconditioned stimulus has elicited a reflex response. And then we have extinction, which is when the CS repeatedly shown without the US, so the CR becomes weaker over time, is completely stopped. But we do have spontaneous recovery, which is possible after a rest period. Theories of conditioning include the stimulus substitution theory, preparatory response theory, compensatory response theory, the Korler-Wagner model, and a few others by McIntosh, Pearson, Hall. Chapter 4, Pavlovian Applications. Many find its practicality to be in question, but it's helped with many problems such as fear, prejudice, paraphilia, taste aversion, advertising, drug addiction, and healthcare. Fear. Watson and his students, they realized that only a few stimuli can elicit strong emotional responses, and that emotions are learned through Pavlovian conditioning. So they came up with the term conditioned emotional response, and it helped in understanding and treating emotional disorders, especially phobias. And it also came up with the idea of counter conditioning or exposure therapy to reverse these effects in conditioning. And that's just some of the examples of how this type of conditioning is applied in everyday life. Chapter 5, Operant Learning Reinforcement. Thorndike, he was observing and studying animal intelligence. Stories of animal behavior was far-fetched, to say at the very least. So he found out that you can study animal intelligence, but you have to study how they learn. So that brings up his puzzle box, one of some of his famous experiment with the cats. And over time, he noticed that they got quicker at pulling the loop or steeping on the treadle to reach the food. So he realized that there was a relationship between behavior and the consequences from It's a fact. And the same thing can be seen by stuff done by Skinner. Skinner made a box where the rat can produce food into the tray to eat by pushing the lever. So operant learning occurs because the behavior is dependent on the environment, and it's also called instrumental learning. Reinforcement is an increase in behavior shrink due to its potential consequences. 4 types of learning include positive reinforcement, which is reward learning, negative reinforcement, which is escape training, positive and negative punishment that we talked more about later. Positive means that something is added to reinforce the behavior, and negative means something is removed to reinforce the behavior. Variables that can affect operant learning include contingency, which is correlation between behavior and consequences, continuity, which is the gap between the time of behavior and the reinforcer characteristics, behavior characteristics, and motivating operations. Theories of positive reinforcements includes the Hall drive reduction theory, the random value theory, and the Premack principle, the response preparation theory. And then you have the theories of avoidance, which is the 2-process and 1-process theory. Chapter 6, reinforcement beyond habit. Many dismiss operant learning, aka reinforcements, as just habit, establishment, and breakage. But it can be seen in shaping, chaining, insightful problem solving, creativity, helplessness, and superstition. Just think about this. Behavior can't be reinforced if it never occurred. So that brings me to the idea of shaping, which is described in the textbook as reinforcement of successive approximations of desired behavior. So to speak, the more you increase a reinforcement is how you shape a behavior. It is a natural occurring phenomenon that both Thorndike and Skinner did not recognize initially. So, i.e., tantrums, children learn that from their parents' behavior. The parents' behavior increases over time, so the consequence is an increase in the child's tantrums. Another example is chaining, when you teach a person or an animal to perform a behavior in a chain. Now researchers realize that solutions don't disappear, but are a result of learning history. Chapter 7, Schedules of Reinforcement. Skinner and Forster established the schedules of reinforcement variation following strict rules between behavior and reinforcement. They produce distinctive patterns called schedule effects. Far from learning new behavior not acquired, but learning also includes no behavior change. So we have simple schedules, which can be continuous, which are the simplest forms, which just means that behavior is reinforced each time it occurs and it rapidly increases behavior. Or we have the intermittent schedules, and that includes the fixed ratio, the variable ratio, the fixed interval, and the variable interval. And it does include extinction, but extinction is not a schedule. It just happens when the reinforced behavior is no longer being reinforced. It does, however, increase variability of the behavior, specifically aggression. And it can lead to the resurgence of behavior that was previously extinguished. Then we have compound schedules, which are various combinations of simple schedules. We have the multiple schedules, which uses the influence of 2 or more simple, or the mix, that do the same thing, but they do it without any stimuli. The partial reinforcement effect. Behavior is more resistant to the extension on the intermittent schedule than continuous. Some hypotheses for the effect are the discrimination hypothesis, the frustration hypothesis, the sequential hypothesis and the response unit hypothesis. Thorndike said, Chapter 8, Operant Learning Punishment. Thorndike said that the behavior is a function of its consequences. And so he first believed that negative punishments weaken behavior and positive strengthen behavior, believing that we learn from success and not failure. However, he and Skinner both underestimated the power of punishment. Punishment is described as a decrease in behavior strength due to its consequences. And we have two types of punishment, positive and negative. Positive meaning that an increase in the stimulus intensity, and negative was a decrease in the intensity of a stimulus, also called planetary changes sometimes. Some variables affecting it are the same as the ones that affected reinforcements. And then again, some theories of punishment include the two-process theory and the one-process theory. And some problems include imitation, abuse, aggression, apathy, and escape. Alternative is response prevention, where the environment is altered or extinction can occur. Chapter 9, Operant Applications. Many people are unaware of the value of operant applications in many areas of life. And then some of these areas include homeschool, clinic work, and zoo. So at home, it especially seen, operant learning is seen in poor quality orphanages. Many of these children experience neglect in the form of emotional security from adults. And as soon as you take these kids and put them in high quality foster homes, you can see the improvement. You can see how learning, especially from the adults in your environment, can affect your behavior. And it's also seen in the clinic and the health realm. Children with autism or intellectual disabilities, would bang their heads and poke their eyes out, and they, scientists believe that the behavior was involuntary. But Lovas discovered that this self-injury behavior could be affected by consequences. So over time, more researchers looked into it in ways to correct the behaviors without the use of physical punishment. And lastly, Chapter 10, Observational Learning. It started with Thorndike, who wasn't sure if animals learned by observing others and imitating. Over time, that changed. And you learned that observational learning is when you learn from observing events and their consequences. And there are two types, the social and the asocial. Social means that you observe the behavior and consequences of another person, an active model. And then asocial is the same thing but without an active model. And imitation occurs by behaving in the same manner as a model. So it's a general concept that could account for over intimidation, but that is how observational works. You imitate what you're seeing. And again, variables that affect are the difficulty of a task. The more difficult, the less learning occurs. The characteristics of a model. So is the person attractive, their personality. And then some theories of observational learning include Bandura's social cognitive theory and the operant learning model. And lastly, some applications of learning can be seen in education and social change. As I said before, children learn language from imitating their parents and their teachers. So if a Mother says fish, then the child will say fish as well and learn from that.